everybody, this is Paige from Taylor Sewing Quilt Shop in Brockville, Ontario. Today I'm speaking with Jean Boyd, who is currently a pattern designer for Northcott. She's also a blogger for QuiltSocial and has a expansive teaching career as well in quilting. So I will go on the other side of the table and get the interview started. So Jean, perhaps you could give us a little bit of information about yourself. Where did you grow up?
I grew up in Toronto, and I lived there until the late 1960s, actually, when I moved to Brockville. Always thought I'd go back to Toronto, but it never happened. Here I am.
And you were a school teacher?
Yes, elementary school.
What school did you teach at?
In Toronto. I was with the Scarborough Board of Education. I was in 2 or 3 different schools there, and then I moved to Brockville and started teaching here.
Okay, the primary grades or?
I taught everything eventually from kindergarten to grade 8. I taught mostly music when I was in the schools.
Oh, nice. So when did you first get into quilting?
Quilting, well, back in the late 1970s, that's when the big resurgence of quilting became popular, especially in the U.S., because that was the U.S. bicentennial, and all of a sudden they were reviving some old crafts, as they called them then, and I kind of got hooked on it then. I'd been doing lots of sewing and knitting and all kinds of other things, and I thought, oh, well, here's something new I can try, you know, and I thought, well, that'll last a year or two, but here I am, many years later, still at it.
Now, did you work at a particular quilt store, or did you start teaching kind of just as a hobby? Teaching quilting, that is.
Yes. Well, it was very interesting because I wanted to learn. Of course, late 1970s, there weren't any classes. There were no quilt shops in the area. I think there was one quilt magazine available, which was Quilter's Newsletter. So I bought that. There were no books available. It was all learn as you go sort of thing. So anyway, that's what I did. I took some courses in the U.S. actually, and learned from some excellent teachers there. Just did it on my own. And then St. Lawrence College here in Brockville started a quilting course. So I signed up for that. I thought, this is perfect. I can learn how to do it properly, because I was just learning out of books and magazines. So I went. The class was awful. The first night, I went with a friend, and we both looked at each other at the break and said, no, this isn't for us. So we became college dropouts on the very first evening. And then I went back to just learning on my own. Books, the odd television program that was there, magazines, that sort of thing.
And now the guild, you also started the guild here in Brockville.
Yes, I was one of the founding members. There were a group of us. We used to get together on Monday afternoons, and there were maybe 10 or 12 of us, and we always said, yeah, we should have a guild here in Brockville, and we never did. Finally, we said, we are going to have a guild here in Brockville. So we started the Thousand Islands Quilters Guild, and there are some members from that founding group who are still members of our guild today, some 30 years later.
Yeah, it's neat. So how did you get into actually designing patterns?
Well, it goes back to when I started teaching quilting, which is another strange story, because even though I had dropped out of the college course, the local school board was running night school classes at the time in all kinds of different fields. So I thought I was, you know, pretty expert. I'd been doing this for 3 or 4 years. So I invited myself actually to start teaching at the high school on an evening, and they said, sure, you can do that. And they didn't ask for a resume. They didn't know what my background was or anything. So I actually started teaching for the local school board here in their evening night school classes. And then I was hired by St. Lawrence College, which was a huge bonus for me, because I was able to start the fiber arts program in quilting. I ended up writing all the courses for that program, and it's a certificate program, which is still on the books, not terribly active right now, but it was a very vibrant program for many, many years at St. Lawrence College. So that's really how I got into the teaching part. And then as far as designing patterns, well, I was writing notes for my students all the time anyway, and I was always doing notes and handing them out. And I thought, well, maybe I'll just write a pattern. And again, it was, I really didn't know what I was doing when I started. So I just did that. And then there was one quilt shop in town by this time. It was called Annabelle's Quilt Shop.
I remember Annabelle's, yeah.
Yes, it was owned by Colleen McMahon, and I was teaching some classes down there. And Colleen was a wonderful support to me, because every time I would write one of these little patterns, and she'd say, okay, I'll buy some of those and put them in the shop, which was great because she had a huge clientele at the time. And people were coming in and I think buying the patterns, taking them back to wherever their hometown was. And they were sharing them with friends and other quilt shops. And then I started getting orders for patterns, and it just kind of went on from there.
So how did you get connected with Northcott? Did Northcott approach you like at market, or how did that all happen?
Well, it was sort of like my teaching for the school board. I invited myself. I did meet Patty Carey, who was with Northcott then, and still is, of course. But anyway, I met her at Quilt Market because I was there with Annabelle's Quilt Shop, and I said, could I write some patterns for you? I really can't believe the nerve that I had back in those days that I thought I could do this. But anyway, she said, yes, sure. And so I started there, very simply. And then I had a lot of help with some other pattern designers as well, namely Daphne Gregg, who I know you have also interviewed,
yes,
and Susan Perney Mark, and they were a few years ahead of me in the designing process. They're from BC. I met them at Quilt Market. I didn't know them before. I went to one of their presentations. We got talking, and as fellow Canadians, we were sharing information, and they were a huge help to me when I first started. And yes, so I've been designing for Northcott now for almost 20 years.
Wow, that's really neat. Now, what about QuiltSocial? How did that come about? Because you do, I know through the shop and talking with you that you'll do like, get a sewing machine and then create something and then you'll blog about it, I guess. So how did that come about?
Right. Well, I probably approached Carla, who is the editor of that, at the same, yes, on some of my more nervy days, I guess. I said, I would like to write for that. And she said, sure. So I've been doing that for several years as well. And I work with different sponsors. I've worked with Northcott Fabric. And when I do blogs for them, they will send me a bunch of fabric and say, okay, this is what we want to feature this week. Nice. And then I'll design something and write the 5 blogs about it. And I've also worked with Brother Sewing Machines. I've worked with H.A. Kidd, who are wonderful suppliers of notions. So again, the companies will just send me something and say, this is what we want to feature, basically do something with it.
So in my little bit of research I did, I read that you have taught extensively across Canada, including 6 Quilt Canada conferences. What has been the most rewarding aspect about teaching quilting to others?
Well, I think it is when I'm teaching students, especially beginners, and they come in as beginners, that they have no skills. And I really like to emphasize the basic techniques, basic sewing, accurate sewing, and cutting techniques, that sort of thing. And then I like to encourage students, once they've got the basics, to take off and do their own thing. Or if I give them a pattern, say, you don't have to follow this exactly. You can make it your own. Try something different. Try some new designs. So I'm really thrilled when people will, even the patterns that I write now, if they take a pattern and then expand on it and do something different, I love to see that. And I quite often get people who send me pictures and show me things that they've done.
And just to note for everybody listening, the quilt that's hanging behind Jean is one of her patterns. It's called Shanley Square. And so we've made it up in some of our boutiques here. And then our Sylvia Bemby, who works here, she's done the quilting on it. And it's absolutely beautiful. I'll try to do a close-up a little later. So can you tell us about anything that you might be working on right now that's exciting that might be coming out soon?
Right now, well, of course, with the pandemic, there's been lots of time to be at home, of course. I've been doing a lot of hand stitching. I've kind of got really interested in raw edge applique, just putting a piece of fabric down, no fusible or anything, just hand stitching around the edges. So I've done quite a few pieces like that. I've also very recently just got into dyeing of fabric with natural dyes, which is another interesting thing too. And again, it's a huge field. I didn't know how big it was when I started playing around with this, but there's a lot to learn. But it's fun. I'm just using things out of the fridge, basically. You know, I've dyed with red cabbage and onion skins, and turmeric gives you a wonderful yellow color when you're dyeing fabric. So those are my two latest
So it
playthings.
sounds like you're always being creative and just willing to try something new.
I do like experimenting, and I still take classes. I've done lots of Zoom classes, of course, during the pandemic, and it's wonderful because you can get to talk to teachers from all over the country, all over the world, actually.
Yeah, that's the one nice thing about it. Well, thank you very much, Jean. It was a pleasure asking you some questions and learning a little bit more about your background.
Thanks, Paige.
You're welcome.
I'm happy to have been here.